let's talk about Loguetown. Now, this arc is usually described as the final arc of the East Blue Saga in One Piece, but I would argue that the true final arc of East Blue is Arlong Park. Arlong Park is where the emotional and thematic core of the story reaches its peak, and by the time that arc ends, the crew has come together and the central themes of freedom and resistance against oppression have been firmly established. So to me, the narrative feels rather complete. Loguetown, rather than functioning as the climax of East Blue Saga, it acts more like a narrative frame. And to provide some evidence for this, as always, let's start with the name Loguetown. Loguetown is called the town of the beginning and the end. I think that's what it's called. And this obvious interpretation is that that's the place where Roger's journey began and the place where it ended. He died. But I think that phrase also really describes the structure of the arc if we look at what Logue means. Now, we see this root in words like dialogue and monologue, but it also appears in literature in the words prologue and epilogue. Now, if you are not a big reader of literature, a prologue appears before the main narrative begins, and the purpose of it is to really establish the tone of the story, introduce important themes, or provide background context that will become relevant later. And sometimes a prologue even presents a very mysterious event or person that will only become clear much later in the story. An epilogue also functions as a frame, but this appears after the main narrative has concluded, and it provides closure by showing where the characters end up, revealing future consequences of the story, or hinting at what might come next. Now, both prologues and epilogues serve the same basic function. They frame the narrative and they define where the story begins and where it ends. Now, unlike previous arcs, Loguetown does not introduce a new villain who must be defeated. We are introduced to Smoker, who is actually shown to be kind of a good person and is just doing his job following orders of the Marines and the world government. And we do have Lady Alvida and Buggy returning to cause more chaos, but there's no real new villain that must be defeated by the Straw Hats like in all of the other arcs. Instead, this arc really revisits the foundational ideas of the saga and then places them into the wider historical context of Roger and his execution. And historically, executions were not just punishments. They were public spectacles that were designed to communicate a message. And we can see this very clearly in Loguetown with the scaffold in the town square elevated high above the crowd so that everyone can see and witness this message that is being sent by the government. And in this case, it is that piracy is going to end. So in this way, Loguetown behaves very much like a literary epilogue. It is drawing back on what has already happened, it is reminding the audience of the figure who shaped the current era, and it shows us how the world really interprets that history. We also see Shanks again for the first time since Romance Dawn, which is hinting that he's going to be back in the narrative sometime soon. We also get hints of conflicts to come that do not just involve individual enemies, but rather entire systems of power. And at the same time, I think Loguetown really functions as a prologue. So beyond Loguetown lies the Grand Line, and everything about the narrative thus far suggests that the adventures of the East Blue were relatively contained. With Luffy and the crew now escaping Loguetown, we are at the beginning of a much bigger adventure than we previously saw. And we are also introduced to a mysterious new figure named Dragon. So remember, I said prologues often have a bit of mystery that is later on tied back within the main narrative, and since we don't have any answers about who Dragon is, unlike other mysterious figures like Mihawk, which we learned a little bit about, I do assume that Dragon is going to be a key person in upcoming arcs, whether that's as a Straw Hat or a villain, I don't know at this point. So Loguetown really stands between these two narrative phases. Roger's journey started in Loguetown and ended at the execution platform, and then we have Luffy arriving at the exact same location, standing on the same scaffold where Roger once stood, and he is awaiting his own execution. But the deeper irony of this moment is that Luffy would have never arrived there at all if Roger's story had truly ended. Roger's execution was meant to close the narrative of piracy, and instead his final words do the exact opposite. So rather than allowing his death to serve as the epilogue to piracy, he transforms it into a prologue for Luffy's story. His declaration about the One Piece ignites the Great Pirate Era, which sends countless people, including Luffy, out to sea in search of the treasure that he left behind. So Luffy's dream really exists because Roger's ending became the starting point for a new generation. So in that sense, Loguetown is both the place where Roger's story concludes, but also the place where his ending becomes the prologue to another story. And this act of rebellion is also another interpretation of the name. So in Japanese, there's no difference between L and R, so we can read the name as Loguetown or as Roguetown. And as we know, a rogue is someone who refuses to follow the rules of the system. They are unpredictable, they are disruptive, they are difficult to contain, and that is exactly what Roger, Luffy, and the Straw Hats are. Now, if we look deeper at the spelling, there are also more ways that we can analyze this name. So Loguetown begins with the sound ro, and that sound appears at the very beginning of the series in Romance Dawn. I think it is intentional that Romance Dawn and Loguetown are the narrative frames of this story because they really mirror each other. So in Romance Dawn, Luffy's dream exists in its purest form because it has not really been tested yet. For Luffy, the sea is open, the future is open, and Luffy says what he wants because he is free to write his own story. And throughout the East Blue Saga, Luffy's dream has pretty much operated at this level of his own personal conviction. He says he will be the Pirate King, he has his Straw Hat friends supporting him, and he encounters villains who, yes, stand in his way, but are not in direct contrast to his dream. But when he arrives in Loguetown, that dream is now being tested at the scaffold where the world once tried to prove that piracy could be ended. So that repetition of the ro, I think, is the narrative coming back to its own beginning. And something else that is interesting about this ro is that this character in katakana also really looks like this kanji, which means mouth. Now, they are not the same character, but the resemblance, I think, is striking, and I don't think it is a coincidence. So remember when we said that Log refers to speech? Well, I think that Loguetown can also be really interpreted symbolically as the mouth of this history. So Roger's execution was meant to deliver the message that the age of pirates had ended, but instead of allowing his execution to silence piracy, he uses his final words to ignite it, and the moment that was supposed to serve as piracy's epilogue becomes the beginning of the Great Age of Pirates. And when Luffy arrives, the system attempts to repeat that same narrative. Standing on the same scaffold where Roger died, Luffy laughs, just like Roger did. So it seems the story is indeed repeating itself. But then lightning strikes. Now, I have talked a lot about romanticism in previous arcs, and I think it is very relevant in this arc as well. So storms and lightning are often used to express the terrifying and uncontrollable power of nature, and they also often serve as omens of danger. And the power of nature intervening is a common theme throughout East Blue as well, such as when the bird brings Luffy to Nami. But I really want to talk about Frankenstein, because there are a lot of parallels between these two, particularly with the lightning strikes, as you can see. Now, first of all, the entirety of the story is told through a man named Walton, who is recounting Frankenstein's story while they are on the ocean. Now, Walter is on the way to the Arctic and he rescues Frankenstein, and they encounter storms and rough weather similar to Luffy and the crew. Now, Victor recalls watching lightning strike a massive oak tree. And this lightning does not simply burn the tree, it reduces the entire tree to splinters. And this is similar to the execution platform in Loguetown. And this lightning strike is what sparked Victor's interest in pursuing his scientific studies and eventually creating the monster, which was his ultimate downfall. Now, I worry that Luffy being saved by the lightning strike is a similar bad omen, since now Luffy sees himself as being lucky for surviving and is off to the very dangerous Grand Line. I look forward to seeing if this was a foreshadowing for tragedy that will befall Luffy in the future, but I really, really hope not, because I love Luffy. Now, it is also interesting that Frankenstein is called the modern Prometheus, and I have talked about Prometheus before, particularly in relation to the devil's fruits, in that having this power that was not meant for humankind, such as Prometheus bringing fire to humans, ends up hurting Luffy. He can no longer swim, which is dangerous for a pirate at sea. But my favorite connection is this quote that I just find absolutely striking, and it is spoken by Walton when he is describing his ambitions. I want to read it directly from the book so that I don't mess it up. It says, "How gladly I would sacrifice my fortune, my existence, my every hope to the furtherance of my enterprise. One man's life or death were but a small price to pay for the acquirement of the knowledge which I sought, for the dominion I should acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race. Now, this quote really talks about a very dangerous philosophical idea that individual lives may be sacrificed if doing so leads to knowledge or power great enough to change the world. And I think this philosophy really parallels many of the systems of power and the villains that appear throughout the East Blue Saga of One Piece. So many villains believe that their strength entitles them to rule over others, and so they treat the suffering of the people as insignificant compared to them maintaining their control. Their logic mirrors Walton's claim that individual lives are expendable in the pursuit of power. And Frankenstein himself critiques this mindset. So by the time Walton meets Frankenstein, Victor had already had that similar mindset in the past and realized the terrible consequences of thinking this way. He once believed that through knowledge he could command the forces of nature, but his pursuit instead unleashed a horrendous suffering that he could no longer control. And throughout the East Blue, we have villains and the Marines alike who believe that they have absolute control through their strength or authority. But that sudden lightning strike that really interrupts what appears to be an inevitable moment of Luffy's death reminds us that forces larger than human power can intervene and often do. But I also think this quote invites us to reflect on the legacy of Roger himself. So his execution ignited the Great Pirate Era. And in some ways, I think Roger's actions echo Walton's idea that one life may be a small price to pay for something world-changing. So Roger's death became the catalyst for the Great Pirate Era, but I think that the Great Pirate Era is really morally ambiguous. It does inspire dreams of freedom and adventure, but it also unleashes chaos, violence, and countless tyrants who seek to dominate and control over innocent people. So like the ambitions described in Frankenstein, Roger's spark really transformed the world in ways that no single person could fully predict or control, and I think both stories raise the same question. When someone unleashes a powerful force into the world, whether that's knowledge, ambition, or a new era, can they truly predict or control the consequences that follow? Now, I can't say for sure whether the Great Pirate Era was a good thing or not because I am just now getting out of the East Blue Saga, but what I can say is that history rarely deals in absolutes. There's rarely black or white. There's a whole lot of gray in the middle. So, I don't know. Let me know what you think about this deep dive. Let me know what you think about these ideas, and I'm really looking forward to continuing with Reverse Mountain and the other arcs in this next saga. And I'm sorry it took me so long to film this one. Life was just lifing, but I hope you guys enjoyed this, and let me know what you think in the comments.